So I want to start off just with a few slides talking about our approach to agentic identity, maybe some state of the art or like the meta in MCP Auth, and then I'll dive into a quick demo of an authorized MCP server and what we're thinking about. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Rohit. I work as an AI product manager at Descope. I joined about 2 months ago from Microsoft. Previously, I was at Microsoft working on Azure developer experiences. I got to work all over the place, like on the SDKs, on some of our coding agents, like GitHub Copilot for Azure. And then right before I left, or just pretty shortly after before I left, I started working on the MCP project at Microsoft and launched the Azure MCP server. I have a website. I guess I'll include that in the chat maybe, but um, I guess I'll dive right in since I want to be efficient with time. So thinking about agentic identity today, there's kind of like two levers you can have in terms of identity. And the main thing is there's obviously what you use to identify a certain agent or a certain user, but also there's these are important attributes to keep track of and as a part of policy management as well. Because there are, I think, in startup land, like at Descope compared to Microsoft, there's very different usage policies for what I can use and what I'm authorized to use, what those tools are authorized to access. So starting with the MCP client, there's kind of the client type, for example, that we can take a look at. Like I can look at ChatGPT specifically as an agent or Claude as an agent. That's part of the agentic identity. And then also there's the user. And this kind of pattern of agents today we call user consented, because usually what will happen is that an agent will try to do something. It'll prompt a consent flow or consent experience for the user. Like, do you authorize this app to have access to these resources? So that's what we call, at least at Descope, a user consented agent. And generally, it starts with a prompt to the agent, and it's a direct authorization request right after. So going into the user, of course, if I'm working within an enterprise or a company, there's details on the users like roles that could be very helpful with determining policy and as a part of that agentic identity. So when I say there's two levers, those are kind of like two different areas where depending on the client or depending on the user, you can start to enforce policy. So one question I get a ton is like, why is agent identity different than, for example, a user identity? And I think there's a whole lot of reasons, but I think I tried to summarize my main thoughts on this slide. The first thing is human scopes, for example, if I go to Google Calendar and it gives me write access means I can do anything on Google Calendar pretty much. I can edit meetings, create them, delete them, and so on. But that works for a human. But in the case of an agent, following the principle of least privilege, then agents are very task-based. So it may come down to be more granular than that. Maybe I want the agent to have the ability to update and create a meeting, but not delete them. And those kind of permissions are task-based as opposed to being scope-based, because those scopes are built for humans. So when you have a token, it's not simply just giving the token to the agent. There has to be some sort of, at least from Descope's perspective, there should be some sort of scoping given to the agent in terms of what it can actually do using the tools or tasks that it's given. Additionally, agent identity lifecycles are, I'll just say, different. Depending on the actual session of how the agent's running, the life cycles, the management, the entire process of an agent identity can vary a lot. And I think one point I really want to emphasize is that a lot of the way that we treat agentic identities so far has been driven by like giving access to resources, which is pretty much OAuth. Like we're familiar with this problem, like an OAuth-backed API, for example. But when we get into agents, there's a new interaction model where it's not just an application that has access to resources. There is a little bit more thinking that needs to happen in terms of access. So I believe that like when we started MCP server, when MCP popped off, it was like the servers are easy to build because they piggyback on traditional software engineering skills. And I can expose an MCP server very easily, especially with things like fast MCP and so on. But for building agents, there's a little bit more nuance in that. And there's a little bit more specialized skills. For example, like planning, the actual agent's planning, taking care of memory, and so on. These are more specialized skills that I think the industry will slowly catch up on. But however we evolve in terms of how we build agents, that's really going to define like the next wave of agent identity. I think that's one point I do want to make. And additionally, like going into the actual auditing, for example, if I'm an enterprise, I want to see every single action be audited. I want to have dashboards. I want to have huge databases or tables with so much information on what's being accessed when. And agent intentions are delegated, and there's kind of a new compliance problem that emerges when you think about who's directly responsible for something an agent does, if it was authorized or not. So this is why I really think that agent identity is a new field, and it definitely piggybacks on existing identity principles, but there are new problems and new considerations that we just haven't had in the prior. So this is kind of a slide showing like the meta of MCP Auth today, like what's considered the spec. It ignores the lower level protocol details, but these are kind of the high level players that you might have. So we'll start on the left side. Can you see my cursor by any chance when I move it around?
Yep.
Oh, yes. Cool. So on this left side, we have what we call the agentic identity, right? There's the user actually interacting with an MCP client, and then the MCP client itself. Then, for example, if I have an MCP server, the MCP client can go there directly. And the first time it connects, it'll just try and waltz its way in. The MCP server will be like, hey, hold on, you're unauthorized. Go check with my authorization server to get some sort of permissions and then come back. So there's the MCP server and there's the authorization server, which handles client registration and all the OAuth, OIDC steps, the things that I'm sure everyone loves to deal with. But the one important thing to note is that there's kind of like two credentials to worry about. And that's kind of at the heart of how we're solving or how we think about this agentic identity and permissioning and access and so on. There's first the actual access to the MCP server, and then there's these credentials that are needed to talk to either OAuth enabled APIs or APIs based on API keys, or even like sometimes a third-party MCP server if you have one talking to another, which that is a use case which I've surprisingly seen. So regardless of all of this, there's kind of this like token, there's this middleman in terms of token issuance, because again, these tokens are these tokens or API keys come designed for humans, which may not correlate to the actual tool level permissions that we want to have for an agent. So there is that's kind of how we're looking at this problem, where again, the agent is task-based. So how can we issue some sort of access level at the task level for the agent? So I'll go more into the authorization server part, since that's kind of what Descope does. And I'll talk specifically about client registration, because this is a very interesting problem. Essentially, in client registration, this is an application getting access to your resources. So before agents, the most common way for this to, or for a client to get access to resources is the OAuth client credentials flow. And the way this works is a user would go into a UI like a console or so on. They would generate a client ID or client secret for an app. And then I would grab those values and then go back to something like Claude Desktop and go copy paste those in. And while this works for, smaller agent use cases, if I ever want to have if I ever want to open up my MCP server to the world, this might not be the way to do, because there's a lot of manual work required, and it just doesn't scale very well. It's a lot of effort required for manual configuration of client ID and client secret. So that led to something more dynamic, which is dynamic client registration. And this is kind of where we're at today. This is the solution we've landed on for now. If you're familiar with MCP Auth, it started off with like no auth, and then it went to, okay, roll your own auth in the MCP server. And then now we're in the world where you can have an authorization server do this for you. But we're here with dynamic client registration. And the way it works is the client will go to the authorization server. It'll get some metadata, specifically with details on registration. I don't know if I can zoom in or maybe not, but can everyone see that? It's a little small. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's
cool.
It's passable.
Okay, I'll take passable. Thank you. So yeah, the agent the client will receive a metadata document that has details on the registration endpoint, and then it will go to that registration endpoint. And there's these optional steps which I'll touch on later, but in general, it will take that information from the register endpoint. It will post to it with client metadata and the access token if that's enforced. And then the authorization server validates all of that and issues a client ID and client secret. And then now you can do your standard OAuth or OIDC, where it would pop up a consent screen and everything, now that you've registered a client. But this happens as a part of the client first going to the MCP or going to the authorization server to register. So from a scalability perspective, this is really nice because you don't have to manually configure the client ID, client secret anymore. The agent can kind of know to just go ahead and do that. But this does come with a few risks, which I'll touch on. First, when you do dynamic client registration, this register endpoint that's given to the client to go to post to, it's open to any client. So any client on the internet could potentially post to this endpoint, which leads to a whole lot of security risks like malicious IPs or bad like MCP clients and so on. There's a lot of security risk here. Another thing is authorization is hard to enable because there's only so much client information that you get when the client goes through dynamic client registration. And the reason why it's not suggested as the long-term solution mainly is because it requires the identity provider, like a Descope or so on, to have extra hardening of this step. Like the steps of, for example, blocking IP traffic or only allowing certain MCP clients, that has to fall on the identity provider. And that's a lot of features to ask for that probably could live in a protocol or some sort of overall decision on how we do client-side verification of how we do verification of an MCP client. So that brings in the next proposal, which is kind of the next state of MCP Auth. And this is client ID metadata documents. So this is the specification enhancement proposal 991, if you want to go look that up on the MCP repo. But essentially what this is the client is now responsible for hosting a metadata document on an HTTPS URL. And the idea is that since it's an HTTPS URL, there's like some added level of security to this metadata document that's being hosted. And what happens now is that the client gets its metadata document and passes that in as the client ID. Then the authorization server will go there, check the metadata. It will get all of the different values, for example, the name, the redirect URIs, and so on. And then it will initiate that consent screen depending on what it sees. And the nice thing here is that the client can connect to an authorization server with all of the information that it wants in hand. The only challenge here is that the client is now required to host this metadata document. So if I'm doing a web-based client, for example, it could work really well because I have already a backend where I could just put an extra file, right? Like a JSON can live. But if I'm doing something like a desktop client, now I'm required to have an HTTPS hosted client metadata document. So it actually doesn't solve the problem entirely, but it solves it a lot more. And if you're curious, here's what an example of a CIMD or client ID metadata doc would look like. And for an authorization server like Descope, this is like a gold mine. This gives us a lot of details on the incoming client, which we can use to enforce policies. So it's kind of a win-win for both, or it's a win for the authorization provider, but from an agent builder perspective, to actually have this and follow the latest standards in security, there's some extra work required of hosting this document. But I can take in different items like the client name, for example. I can also look at redirect URIs. I can also look at the URI itself to identify the agent that's coming in. And then that gives us an identity, at least from the application itself that's connecting to our MCP server. So it's an improvement. It's coming out in the next MCP spec. I think if you're building agents, it's something to take a look at, especially if you're building agents for compliant workflows. And this is my last slide that kind of goes back on why I think the evolution of agent identity will come from the agent side. I think, like I said before, the current OAuth mechanisms that we have today can be good enough for today's agents. Like DCR can work if provided that the identity provider has some sort of hardening on its side. But the interaction model has, as it goes more autonomous, that really changes a lot of things. And just some new challenges that I'm thinking of, that we're thinking about at Descope are. The first one is, if I have a local host agent or a desktop client, and there isn't a hosted client ID metadata doc, how do I know I can trust it? That brings into things like software statements or like OS level attestation. And there's a whole bunch of ideas that are floating around in the space, but how do we actually trust local agents? You know, for example, Cursor, they could probably host a client ID metadata document as even if they're a local host agent. But if you're a smaller agent or agent builder, or maybe you don't have that at hand, or if you want to run an agent locally on a custom OpenAI agents SDK, for example, in your machine, that might be seen as an untrusted agent now in the future. So how do we actually trust that? That's one thing that we're looking at or thinking about. Another thing is, especially as agents go into the background and start doing background tasks, this is why I keep mentioning the interaction model. Like if it's just chatbot based, it's pretty straightforward. We have OAuth mechanisms for that. But what if an agent's running in the background for 2, 3, 4 hours, comes back with a request to create a pull request on GitHub? How does that client-initiated authorization request come into play? Additionally, the last thing that we're thinking about, and I think what a lot of identity providers are thinking about, is cross-domain identity assertion, meaning we have this solution in place in Descope. We take care of that with our proprietary solution for if an agent has this token that we've given it, can we map the scopes in that token to the actual human scopes so it can execute the tool or it can't execute the tool? The idea with cross-domain identity assertion is that if an agent comes in with a certain token, there's already some expectation on the other side, for example, like a Google or HubSpot, on what that token can access. Which, in my opinion, it's an interesting problem, but I think there needs to be new scopes or needs to be some sort of specialized work that goes into this. This is a problem called, or this is a space called IDJAG, which a lot of people are talking about. Cool. So I have a Claude here, and I'll connect it to my custom Descope demo MCP server. Let's see. Waiting for this. And there we go. We have a custom consent screen that's added that allows the agent to do certain things. And then Descope, we also support optional scopes. So if I don't want my agent to read HubSpot data, I can uncheck that. And then when I click authorize, it'll ask me for a specific API key from HubSpot. If I have one, I can just skip this since it is an optional scope. And then I can log in here, allow access to my Google Calendar. And then I can send myself back to Claude. How do I go back to chat from this UI?
It's pretty confusing. I think you click the sidebar on the besides settings. It's very confusing UI.
Okay, cool.
There we go.
All right. So I have this MCP client connected to my MCP server, which is authorized with Descope. I have a few details on my identity now within the Descope console. So I have my user, or I have my app that's been configured, which is here. And when that whole registration process happened via DCR, again, it kicks off the, it tried to go to the MCP server directly. MCP server said, go check in with Descope. Then it went to the authorization server and it kicked off that consent screen that we saw. So now that's registered. Actually, we have the ability to label this based on the redirect URI that we identified during dynamic client registration. And they have some existing scopes. And again, this one is not mandatory. And I can go in the consents here and I can see that there's an associated user. And that associated user is actually me. So I already copied this and gone into my users field and within Descope, and I can see my different roles. So I have the role of viewer here. And what that means is I have a configured Google Calendar. Oops. I have a configured Google Calendar, which has access depending on the incoming user roles. So if the user role contains viewer, then my accessible scope is, it's hard to see, but it's, let me edit this. It is calendar read only. But if I have a scheduler role, then I'll just get all the scopes, which essentially is just, I think it's just literally called Google Calendar. So with this, we can enforce some sort of human-based role access as well as the agent-based. Another thing that we talked about was like how DCR is a little bit sketchy sometimes. So one thing that Descope has is the ability to do an assessment flow. And this is our flows product, which essentially makes all of our consent screens and so on no code if you'd like. So you can edit all of these based on just conditional statements. You can execute some code and so on. But that allows us to run a policy here. And I can look in the redirect URI field directly. And if I see it contains something like Claude AI, I can explicitly call that out as agent is Claude. Or if I allow local host agents, if I see the redirect URI points to a local host or Cloudflare or so on. And then from there, I can have I can mark apps as verified or unverified, and then I can apply policies like only verified apps can access this or so on. So that's the, I guess, the agent lever that we can pull for agentic identity enforcement. So if I try and say something like, go back to my client and say, schedule a meeting on October 29th at 3 p.m. ET with Kevin at descope.com titled test. I've already connected the MCP server, I believe. Oh, I haven't even turned it off. Oops. Or I haven't even turned it on. 1 second. There we go. I have the Zoom thing in the way. Why is this not connected?
I wonder if you need to refresh your Claude desktop. I think sometimes it.
Let's try. I'm not a Claude Power user, but it's can I turn this on? No, I cannot. Let me try and disconnect and reconnect it. Let's see.
I feel like I should insert some joke here about how Warp can do it without.
Yeah, I will say this is on the client side. I hate to throw Anthropic under the bus here, but
this is a cool demo though.
Yeah,
I've got to try this out.
So let's see. Is this connected now? Okay, cool.
Nice.
So I have this meeting here, and I can ask the agent to execute this tool. And so it'll identify, you know how MCP works. It'll identify the create calendar event, and then it will run the tool. But there is an access issue, because although it has access to this tool on the MCP server side, it actually doesn't have I don't have the scheduler role applied within Descope. So what I can do is go into my users. I remember we have this only viewers can, or only the viewer role can view, and then if you have the scheduler role, you can do read and write access. So I can go into my users, I can find myself, I can go and edit. And again, this is manual, but you can also have this be like an automated process as well. You can add scheduler, hit save, and then let's try it again. And sometimes Claude is a little bit smart. It won't try and use the tool again because it recognized it failed the first time, but let's just go ahead and test this. Hoping this one works. Sometimes it takes a while to propagate roles as well, just standard role-based access. Cool, and there we go. It actually got to create the meeting now. So we can see that there's like multiple levers that we can control on the agent identity itself, either about the user or the agent itself. And that's pretty much the demo, just showing off what authorization looks like at an MCP server.